Welcome back to Asian Art. In our final lecture today, we're going to look at perhaps one of the most popular art forms in the world, Japanese comic books, manga. Now, as we last left our history of Japan, we were talking about the Edo period, where no one was allowed in and no one was allowed out. And while Japan stayed relatively stable and peaceful and fairly prosperous during this time, the rest of the world raged on. And especially in Europe, where they experienced an industrial revolution, none of this technology really had entered into Japanese society until it came in by force when the American Commodore Perry arrived in Japan in 1856 and essentially dictated the terms of Japan's opening up to the rest of the world. During this transition, Japan decided it did not want to become a vassal state under the control of more powerful Western countries, like they had seen happen in places such as Myanmar and Southeast Asia and India. And they wanted instead to dictate the terms of their own future. And so they took on a very ambitious transformation into a modern society. Rushed in to take a look at this fascinating country. Japanese art, as I mentioned in our last lecture, had a huge influence on Western tastes and styles at this time. With the opening up of Japan, Western artifacts began to flood the world. And Western art started to come into Japan as well. One British journalist by the name of Charles Berkman had come to Japan as a correspondent for a British paper. He arrived, quickly decided that he loved it in Japan, and so he promptly quit his job and began publishing his own newspaper in Japan for expats like himself. In his humorous illustrated magazine called the Japan Punch, in Yokohama, here he published what has to be the very first European-style illustrated comics, as they were well known in humor magazines such as the British publication Punch. And this is the sort of first introduction Japan had to this kind of humorous illustrations. Bergman did lots of sketches from life, talked about what it was like to be in this country that was coming to terms with Westernization. And his illustrations sort of began new ideas about what was possible in newspapers at this time, in this Westernization sort of fascination with all things Western. And so the very first cartoons in all newspapers in Japan were called punchii, punch drawings, after Charles Bergman's introduction of the form. Case for many decades, and it wasn't until late 20s when a very famous artist by the name of Rakuten Ki Tazawa, who had a long history making sort of punchy style drawings, started making looser, sketchier drawings and a more playful, childish manner. And these he called manga. And this is sort of the first time we have this word manga applied to humorous Western-style comics. And so this is what we see here. Now, this is a comic that has been translated into Italian, okay? So that's what you're seeing here. Except we have this fifth panel toward the bottom left. And this is a panel that is untranslated because this is the little girl Hanako who is showing off to her uncle this new Western dance she's learned called the Charleston. And so we have the sound of her feet dancing, and this is what this you see translated, not translated from the Japanese, is the sound of her feet dancing. And this is a part of what makes Japanese manga so wonderful, is that it really has this very rich onomatopoeic quality of language that's been brought into this quick gestural, humorous comics for a long time, which were really just dedicated to light family entertainment, children's entertainment. Then Japan, which had its government had been pursuing military expansion throughout Asia, declared war on the United States, and at that point put heavy censorship laws within the country of Japan, and sort of dictating and closing out and controlling all aspects of the news. In 1943, all paper distribution became under direct government control. This meant that any publication that did not have direct government sanction was closed. Comic strips were banned from newspapers the following year, and most people could no longer afford or even find newspapers or magazines or reading anymore. So they devoted to rental bookshops, kashihonya, where people could rent for a small amount. Another very important way that people heard stories was this sort of popular itinerant performers called Kamishibai. The Kamishibai performers were low-class people known as barakumen who would travel around the cities on bicycle, and they would put in their little theaters these pictures. And in these pictures, they would tell stories that would excite the children and adults. And this is sort of this first introduction to this. They would have a little gong, and they would wrap sticks to create sound effects, and they would tell these exciting stories. And at the end of the performance, the gathered kids would be sold candies. And this was a way in which the performer made his living. The artwork in these picture stories were largely really well-talented illustrators who had been out of work. And so they employed their understanding of movies, which prior to the war in the 1920s had been very popular in Japan. You can see the real cinematic influence here. We have foreshortening, we have this bird's eye view, we're looking down on the bandits this child is escaping from. This is a very dramatic picture, hand painted, and these are things that these Kamishibai performers would have rented and then brought on tour with them and then returned once they had sold them and performed them throughout their territory. Stories told on Kamishibai was The Golden Bat, created by the writer Ichiro Suzuki, illustrator Takeo Nagamatsu. These story of the Golden Bat was this really extraordinary hero who had the power to fly, wore a costume, and had this staff that could cause earthquakes, and was the protector of small children. Here you see him on the lower right fending off the evil Nazo. And so these stories, which actually appeared in 1931, make it one of the earliest evidence we have of a superhero comic of sorts. Now, of course, it's not a comic as a comic book, but I'm pointing out now that the artists and the people involved in Kamishibai, as soon as the war ended, that was the first place they moved toward. They went into the new comic industry that emerged after the war. So how did that happen? How did comics begin after the war? It all started with one man, Osamu Tezuka, who was known as sort of the god of manga. Not the godfather or anything. He has really single-handedly created this industry. He created comics that were so amazingly popular that everyone copied him and everyone rose to make more of what he was doing, because it showed there was this huge audience for this kind of manga making. So they were very kid-oriented at first. His most popular first style was Shintakashima, New Treasure Island, in 1947. And it has an incredible popularity. They estimate maybe as many as 40,000 copies. And this is right after the war, during the time when people had very little money. And these would be circulated among many people, read and copied. Shintakashima is sort of a mix of Treasure Island from Robert Louis Stevenson and a little bit of Tarzan and a little bit of all kinds of other things. Osamu Tezuka loved Disney and American culture, and Shintakashima is kind of a kind of cinema on paper. And so he took a lot of what we saw earlier in this, in this Kamishibai, and he brought this sort of cinematic action into a new kind of drama. Here is a comic book about two early comic book artists, Fujio and Fujiko, and their experience reading Shintakashima for the first time. You see them breaking out in a sweat as they're kind of cannot believe their eyes, as what they're seeing is so remarkable. And so you see a page. Remember, manga is read from on the right and it goes over to the left. So we see a car rushing across the hill, coming toward us, and then zipping along the bottom of the page. And this is something so revolutionary. It's so remarkable. And if you have to sort of step back and think about it, this is 2 pages of a comic with no dialogue. Up until this point, everyone had making comics where it would be like a theater play where people would sit there or stand there and they'd be telling jokes. And this was a comic, a manga, all about action, things happening, a car zooming across the landscape. This was a comic book based in action. So, to achieve that sense of movement, he'd use a lot of what we call ziplines, and he would distort the landscape, creating a sense of momentum to the pages. There'd be very exaggerated emotional reactions. The characters and the ziplines could heighten the expression on people's faces, creating this kind of emotional drama. Sound, as I mentioned before, was a very important part of the landscape, and you can hear the sounds of things as they're happening. And then there's another really important quality to manga, which is sort of based on Disney's use of this in Bambi, where you have a realistic background and a kind of cartoony characters. So the characters appear sympathetic and childlike, and the landscape seems real and has a kind of import and physicality. And that separation of style between the background and the characters we call masking, and it creates a really sort of interesting dialogue. You see this in a lot of manga even today. Tezuka went on to create an absolute host of incredible characters that even to this day continue to inspire new creations in the world of manga and animated film, anime. Here was his most celebrated early creation, Tetsuwan Atom, the Mighty Atom, which was this little atomic-powered robot. It was intended to make people feel better about atomic power after Japan had been bombed. And in this, he created a kind of Pinocchio character who was a robot who just really wanted to be a real boy. This, of course, has proven to be incredibly popular from 1952 to 1968, and it came over to the US. And several films have been made about the mighty atom, Astro Boy. The next great hit of Osamu Tezuka was called The Jungle Emperor, or Jungle Taite. Now if this strikes you as looking somewhat familiar, I have to have you look at the dates here, 1950 to 1954. This was a color animated TV series, okay, that appeared in Japan in 1965 and later in the US in the 1970s. You might have heard of Kimba the White Lion. Now, the original comic included many scenes which to most people look surprisingly similar to the Disney film Lion King. Now, the coincidence for this is really hard to know. Lion King came out in 1992, I believe, and Osamu Tezuka had been dead for a few years. When the film came out, the Tezuka estate contacted Disney and said, hey, you've created a movie which is very similar to what Osamu Tezuka created. Osamu Tezuka greatly admired Walt Disney, and he credited Walt Disney throughout his life as being a major inspiration for his work. Do you think you could return the compliment and acknowledge Osamu Tezuka's work in your own? The reply from Disney was heartbreaking. Disney has never heard of Jungle Emperor or Kimba the White Lion. Well, evidence suggests contrary to that situation, that in fact Disney had been intending to create a version of this Jungle Emperor and Kimba the White Lion, but they couldn't find someone who actually owned the rights outright, and so instead decided to just call it their own and hope that no one ever noticed. Another very popular adult-themed comic that took the country of Japan by storm was Tomorrow's Joe, Ashita no Joe, by Tetsuya Chiba. Here is the climactic scene of the fight between Joe on the left and his chief rival and friend on the right. And in this boxing match, you can see there the punch has landed on Joe's face squarely, but Joe has returned and hit him with the back of his hand. If you look very carefully, you can see that there's a small sound of a crack as he hit his opponent. And then his friend falls to the ground, dead. In this moment, Joe has won the prize, but he has also fouled his boxing partner and killed his friend. This kind of dramatic action was really quite shocking and inspired many people to protest and shock that they would kill off a major character. And there was never an attempt to kind of bring him back or revive the series. Tetsuya Chiba owned the story outright, and so he created a complete and standalone story that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this is a very interesting thing that's very different from manga, from American comics. American comics, they continue to perpetuate the same characters. It's based on the fact that these characters are owned not by the artists who make them, but the characters are owned by these large corporations that are hiring these artists to make these comics. And so the large corporations do not want to compromise the work of the value of these, we call intellectual properties, popular characters, Superman, Batman, et al. In the case in Japan, the artist owns the copyright, and so they can dictate the terms of how these characters live and die.